Okay, just like in our first video, I'm going to ask you to try to come up with a plan here for the white pieces. Try to see if there's anything that comes to mind and pause the video, come up with a plan. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about double pawns. There are a few ways that we could capitalize on that, but in this video, we're going to talk about one of the most popular ones. Now, before we get started, I'm Natural Master Robert Ramirez, and I wanted to show you, before we go on, I wanted to show you the beginning of the game as well, guys. So you're going to see that this game started with pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and after bishop b5, we have the Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening. And after a6, we have bishop a4 is one of the most popular continuations, but we also have bishop takes c6, and this is going to be officially the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. And after d takes c6, automatically we see the double pawns. Now, for many people, they don't really know what to do with it. But for us, after this video, we have to immediately think of what if we could try to capitalize on the fact that my opponent now has these two pawns in front of each other, which look almost like one pawn. Now, in this game, they did d4, pawn takes d4, queen takes d4, which seems a little bit odd, but the idea is very simple. At this point, if you divide the board in half, you're going to see that the white pieces have 4 pawns on the king side, while the black pieces have only 3. So this is our pawn majority. And thanks to this, we're going to be able to create a passed pawn. If you look now at the queen side, our opponent has 4 pawns versus 3. But again, since they have double pawns, these pawns look like only one pawn. So it's going to be hard for them to create a passed pawn. And that explains this queen d4 move. We're trying to get to an endgame so that we can create a passed pawn and capitalize on it. So the black pieces simply took, then we have knight takes d4, and we got to the position that I showed you before. So congrats if this came to mind, because this is going to make it really easy for the white pieces to win this game. So we have pawn to c5, knight goes to e2, and I'm going to go quickly through the moves because I really want to get to the point where you see that pawn majority in motion, because that's what this is going to be about. So bishop d7, b3, this move I'm going to tell you later why it's considered to be a little bit inaccurate. It's not a good move. But let's keep on going to the critical moment. So bishop c6, f3, not only defending the pawn, but making this bishop pretty bad since we have this pawn chain right here, right? So bishop e7, bishop e2. Now, bishop f6, even though it's not relevant to what we wanted to discuss here, one thing you should know, guys, because it's going to help us come up with a plan. Our opponent, in this variation of the Ruy Lopez, they're trying to, they get compensation because of the pair of bishops. So they're saying, okay, I'm getting double pawns, but I also get my pair of bishops. So they should try to keep it. And after bishop f6, they're allowing us to just get rid of it. And at the same time, notice how the white pieces have no trouble simplifying the game. They wanted to simplify the queen. Now we're looking for any kind of trades so that we can get to the end game. Of course, we want to keep the pawns, but pieces, we're happy to trade pieces. So knight d2, castle, castle queen side. This might seem very basic, but I wanted to highlight it. Notice how they're castling to the queen side. And in part, it has to do with the fact that, again, everybody knows we're getting to the end game. So the king is closer to the center, since if we castle queen side. If, for example, the black king had castled to the king side, it would take him 1, 2, and 3 steps to get to e6. From here, 1 and 2, and they are already in the center. So after castling, we have rook d7, then knight f4, activating the knights, knight c4, b6, and after a4 and a5, we have rook d7. Again, happy to simplify the pieces. If I could right now, I would just trade all of the pieces, knight for bishop, rooks for rooks. Knight takes, and then this rook that is doing nothing, we're going to bring it over to the open file. Knight e5. Now, question for you, and feel free to pause the video. Would you guys trade the knight for the knight? Well, of course, welcome to trade pieces. We're getting to that end game where we could just focus on pushing our pawn. So rook takes. Now pawn to c4, making sure that b5 never occurs. One thing that you don't want to do, whatever happens, you do not want to allow the black pieces to get rid of the double pawns. Of course, b5 is not going to do that. But guess what? They could do c4. And if you take, well, they take a4. But even if you don't take, they could always take on b3. You take back, and all of a sudden they have 3 pawns versus 2. So they have a pawn majority. And in this game, what you're going to see, our plan works because we don't have to worry about whatever the black pieces do on the queen side. So after pawn c4, we got rook e8, and now knight h5 starting to put pressure on the king side. And the next move, rook g8, you might be thinking, okay, how come the black pieces are doing this move? The rook is now passive behind the pawn, but in reality, doing g6 is not better. Now we got a weak square on f6, the knight could get to it and put pressure on the rook as well as the pawn. So after rook g8, now we have rook d3. And for this move, I really want you to pause the video and see if you can come up with the reasoning behind this move. Why do we put the rook on d3? What's the idea behind it? Well, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that our game is going to be on the king side. And of course, it's time to bring the king over. This is an endgame. We know how important it is to activate the king. But if we just do king d2 right now, then our opponent could do the same thing. And in an ideal world, I want to have my king there, but I wish they would leave their king outside of the game. So rook d3 is going to allow me to bring the king over, but at the same time, this king is not going to be able to do the same thing. So we cut him off, and after f6, we got king to d2. Simple move, but guess what? It makes a big difference. So we got bishop e8, the knight has to move. Now bishop d7, king e3. Notice how we're traveling through the dark squares. My opponent has a light square bishop. I want my pieces to be on dark squares. So rook e8. Now knight h5, hitting that pawn again. But now I really like the rook on e7. Now it's defending, but at the same time, it's putting pressure on the e file. But then after rook e7, it's time for the white pieces to start advancing their pawn majority. And I'd really like you to take a moment here, feel free to pause the video, and see if you can come up with the right continuation here. Which of the pawns should we advance? Of course, we're trying to advance one of these three, and we have to be very careful. If we push the wrong one, this game could easily become a drawish position. So in this game, and I hope that you actually pause the video, but in this game, Lasker actually did pawn to g4, which is a really good move. Now, if we had been impatient and we had done something like pawn f4, then the black pieces could find some counterplay with bishop c6. And the idea is pretty simple. They're putting pressure on e4. We need to go over and defend it. But after bishop takes, knight takes, we are pinned. And then f5 is going to get the black pieces a way better position. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, if I go back here, there's a reason why Lasker was the second world champion. He did actually pawn to g4, which is the right move. Now, after g4, we got c6, pawn to h4, king c7, and then we have g5. And after f5, knight g3, of course, we have to go back and defend. Pawn takes, and then right here, I know that a lot of you might think of just taking with the pawn because automatically we get that passed pawn. But there's one thing that we discussed in our first video. Isolated pawns are weak pawns, and at the end of the day, even if it's a passed pawn, the further we push it, the harder it's going to be to defend it. So for that reason, Lasker decided to take with the knight, and he continues to have a pawn majority. It's not 4 versus 3, but 3 versus 2 still is going to give us that passed pawn. So after knight takes, we got bishop f5, and after pawn h5, which by the way, guys, I talked a lot of nice things about Lasker before, but h5 happens to be a mistake because now, instead of the move that the black pieces did here, which is rook d7, they could have done bishop takes e4, pawn takes e4, followed by rook d7. And it looks like, even to me, like if I'm looking at this game, I would say, you know what, this endgame is going to be an easy win. However, if you look deeper into it, after the trade of rooks, it's going to be hard for the white pieces to get in. So this is going to be more like a fortress for the black pieces, and the game is going to end up in a draw. So even at this point, when we feel like we're winning, we cannot let go. We have to stay put and consider everything. And I know, because I've been there myself, many times we get excited, we get ahead of ourselves, and we make silly mistakes like this. And then it hurts. We have been doing a great game up to this point, awesome technique, and then one simple mistake, and the game ends up in a draw. So just because of that, h5, again, you can see even world champions make mistakes, so it makes us feel better about ourselves. So after h5, the black pieces did not do bishop takes e4. Instead, we have rook to d7. So I'm thinking that they were trying to do the same idea. And of course, at this point, Lasker did not take. Now, I'm pretty confident in this position, rook d7 still will give you a good position, but Lasker decided to do rook to c3. Now, obviously, even if the rook gets to d1, they're looking for counterplay, but they're not going to get anything. And it's interesting how this rook, you're going to see it later in the game, how this rook proves to be very useful. It's defending the third rank, and that's where the base of our pawn chain is right now. So b3 is defending these pawns. Well, it's defended by the rook. The same thing for the f3 pawn. So after rook c3, we got rook d1, and then our king continues to make its way up to the king side and to finally advance the pawn. So we're hitting the bishop, bishop d7. Now rook goes to e3, and pay attention to this move. The rook was pretty odd on c3. On e3, it's still defending the third rank, but it's also more active, and it could even help us cut off the king if it ever tries to get in. A few moves ago, I told you we did rook d3 so that the king could come behind it and the king would stay on the wrong side of the board. Well, we cannot forget that. So rook h1, again, trying to create some complications, and at the same time, trying to prevent h6. So that's fine. We go knight g3, hitting the rook, protecting the pawn, rook h4, and our king is happy to continue to travel through the light squares and getting more and more active. Compare the white king to the black king. So rook h3, hitting the knight, we have to either move it, or we could get a little bit creative here and just remember what we're trying to do in this game. Number one, we're trying to advance the pawn majority. Number two, this rook is already on the third rank. So f4 is doing that, two things at the same time. Getting closer to our promotion. Number two, defending the knight with the rook. And it's funny how all of these pieces are on dark squares. So the bishop is not being able to help much. So after pawn f4, we got king d8, and pay attention to that king. That king is trying to get in the action. So we got f5, then rook h4, f6, trying to promote. And after pawn takes, we have again two choices. So what would you do at this position? Would you take with the pawn, or would you take with the king? Now, many people, including myself, will get ahead of ourselves and we will take with the pawn. This is really close now to promotion. It is a passed pawn, but again, it's going to be isolated. But on top of that, taking with the king opens up the rook to cut off the king. This is very, very important. So next time you are trying to push your pawn majority, try to find for ways to keep your opponent's pieces passive, especially that king that we know is really important. So king f6, and again, we don't have a passed pawn, but we have the pawn majority. So bishop e8, now knight f5, no time for them to collect on h5. We're hitting the rook, and if the rook took, there's a very nice tactic. So let me see if you guys can see it. So rook takes h5. What would you do if you were the white pieces? I hope that you paused the video here and you found this brilliant move, rook takes e8. If king takes, knight g7, we collect the rook. This should be extremely easy to finish. Of course, the black pieces did not take on h5, so after knight f5, we got rook f4, g6, finally we get our passed pawn, and after rook g4, we have this nice sacrifice. Maybe it was not that necessary, but I can tell you this has to be the best move. After the king takes and g7, notice how the king again cannot get close to the pawn. Now, after g7, we have king d7, and there is a very interesting continuation now, guys, which I like myself a lot. And that continuation is knight h4. Now, I have to tell you, knight h6 has to be sufficient. We're supporting the pawn to promote, but knight h4, it's definitely more accurate. Now, the question to you is, why do you think they did knight h4? Do you think they're just hoping that the black pieces take the knight and then we promote? Or do you think there's something else hidden in here? Well, if you thought of this very nice resource of blockading, obstructing the rook, then that's exactly what they're going for. So this is the last chance for them to sacrifice the rook for the pawn before it becomes a queen. The moment we do knight g6, that's it. This pawn is going to promote. So rook g7 happened, king takes, and this endgame with an extra knight should be extremely easy for white. Now, I'm not going to leave it here because you're going to see it could get complicated. So let me quickly, guys, show you how they finished. And this is also going to show you how important it is to know endgames. We came from the opening to the middle game, focused on that plan of the pawn majority, but now we cannot blow it. So after king e6, you see the knight coming over, then our king has to get involved quickly. king e4, and then the question for you is, what would you do next if you were the white pieces? And guys, feel free to let me know in the comments below your answer. I'm very curious to know if you get the right answer or not. Well, here after king e4, we have the choice to try to save the knight or ignore it and go king e6. Don't forget, this king and pawns endgames is about active king past pawn. So if the king takes, then it gets away from these other pawns, and my king is just going to be getting closer. So in this game, they didn't take. They went king d3, king d6, king c3, and again, here you could have done knight to d2, defending the pawn. If they take, they just get away from the pawn, so it could take and so on. In the game, they went king c6, king b3, and now again, a move that seems very simple, but we have to be aware of it, is king to b5. We need to defend the two pawns, and now we could easily bring the king. If we want to keep it really simple, bring the knight, collect the pawns. This should be very easy to finish. So guys, before I wrap up, let me go all the way back to the beginning. I know, I think this is just really important. Make sure that you get this under control, exchange variation, and automatically we're thinking of the end game. This is move number 7, and we already know what the game could be like in the end game. And then we try to make our way towards that end game. So I hope that you found this useful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in our next game.